Everyone, I'm Emily Lyons, partner in Husch Blackwell's Food Safety and Regulation Group, where my practice focuses on the regulation of foods, beverages, and agricultural commodities. Before we begin today, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are a number of application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. We will try to answer all of the questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the program materials folder. This program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Towards the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. Finally, if you missed part 1 of the webinar series, which provided an overview of PFAS and the state food packaging bans, you can find a recording of the program just under the media player. Joining me today are Seth Mailhot and Leah Kaiser. As leader of the firm's FDA group, Seth handles a broad array of matters involving FDA-regulated products. Seth's focus is on FDA matters started after he spent several years with the agency as a research scientist and investigator prior to entering the legal profession. As an environmental attorney with a master's in science in environment, ecology, and energy, Leah is among those monitoring and researching legislation, counseling on compliance, and negotiating remedies on environmental issues, including those related to PFAS. So thanks for joining us again today, and we're going to dig much more into managing compliance. As you may be, if you were on our last webinar, as I discussed, we talked about an overview of PFAS. Today, we're really digging into how to establish a compliance plan, the feasibility and capability of testing for products, how to evaluate potential alternative products as you're attempting to look for them to replace PFAS in your supply chains and product offerings, as well as some lessons that we've learned so far through counseling clients with compliance through these bans as they, are revitalizing and changing their supplies. So with that, I will hand things over to Leah.
Thanks, Emily. So as we discussed in part 1, PFAS is ubiquitous in the environment, and this means it can be and often is found in packaging even though it was not intentionally added. This also means that PFAS can be present in your packaging without your prior knowledge. And this is concerning because increasingly federal and state agencies are focusing on addressing PFAS exposure because it is widespread and has been linked to human health concerns. Thus far, these efforts have been primarily aimed at food packaging because it's often a simpler and more effective strategy for reducing PFAS exposure than, for example, like environmental remediation, which is often expensive and difficult to implement. This focus on food packaging is evident, especially by the growing number of state bans. So 11 states have already passed legislation addressing PFAS in food packaging containers and materials, and 8 more have currently pending bills. Furthermore, some of these bans are already in effect, which means failure to comply could result in violations. And these penalties vary by state, but can be assessed at $10,000 or more per day, depending on the state and the willfulness of the violation. PFAS is a priority for federal and state agencies, and food packaging has become ground zero, which makes compliance in this space critical. Unfortunately, compliance in this space is fairly challenging. So despite being critical, managing compliance in this area is challenging for several different reasons. First, there's no unified approach. Federal and state agencies have created their own definitions of PFAS and defined violations differently. So it makes it impossible to have a single compliance strategy. Second, the information you receive from your suppliers, especially overseas suppliers, may not be accurate. Suppliers are also grappling with a changing landscape and may be using different definitions regarding the presence of PFAS in products. Third, suppliers simply might not have the information you're requesting. Although PFAS has been around for some time, it is an emerging contaminant and it may not be on everyone's radar yet. Finally, the type of procurement system you use can significantly impact your compliance efforts. So centralized procurement systems with one buying group operating out of headquarters are often easier to educate and manage than decentralized systems, which may operate differently in different regions. Decentralized systems can also further complicate compliance due to regional approaches and more limited oversight. And I'll turn it over to Seth.
Thanks. So when you're faced with this issue, as I'm sure you all are, we've got to deal with the process of gearing up and monitoring for PFAS. And then, of course, how you deal with the long-term management of this issue. So right now, a lot of companies are dealing with this issue as more of an ad hoc, hastily arranged process where we're really looking at evaluating the product portfolio, determining what laws apply and how they apply to your products, gathering your information from your suppliers, determining the sufficiency of that information as far as relates to compliance with the laws, and then correspondence with customers about the results of that review and the compliance information so the customers can make appropriate decisions. A lot of this, is circular, and there are a lot of steps where, you're going to go back and do these steps over and over again until you really drill down to where you're getting what you need to get yourself and your products into a state of compliance with applicable laws. When you're really dealing with this, though, what you want to look for really is developing a long-term purchasing control system. And this is something that's called out in a number of the FDA regulations. But purchasing controls generally involve having written procedure that determines when you're going to review products and services to make sure that those purchased products and services conform to certain requirements that you're going to establish. There's basically two parts to this. One is you evaluate your suppliers to determine whether those suppliers can meet the quality requirements that you're going to set for them. And then you're going to evaluate and select those suppliers to determine whether or not they're able to meet those requirements. Define the extent and control you're going to exercise over those suppliers over the long term, whether it's facility audits, product testing, reliance on testing that's conducted by your suppliers, and then you maintain records of your suppliers to have that on file so that when you're going to obtain supplies for a new product, you have your list of acceptable suppliers already prepared to resort to. Once you've identified your suppliers for certain products, then you rely on purchasing data to ensure that over time you continue to monitor the quality of those products to make sure that they're meeting the quality requirements that you've established. And, part of this too, under many of the regulatory schemes and including the medical device scheme, they actually require manufacturers to have agreements with their suppliers so that they're required to notify when there are changes to the product to determine whether or not those changes will affect the compliance of the product or the supplied product for the requirements that you've set. And with a lot of these procedures, all of it's documented, and all of this purchasing data needs to be reviewed and approved by a designated individual or individuals. So what's, with this process, it's not a one-man operation. You need to build a multidisciplinary team in order to monitor it. And that includes involving leadership, making sure procurement's involved, sales, regulatory and compliance, quality, legal, and in some cases, if products are coming from outside of the country, imports. The number of individuals, the sophistication of the system that you're going to establish in order to monitor compliance really will depend upon the number of products, the types of issues that you're dealing with, the complexity of the products, and the variety of different packaging that you're trying to monitor. When you take that step of determining the application of the laws to your products, obviously there are a number of considerations. Reviewing each law to make sure that it applies or how it applies to your business and the business of your customers. Whether the food packaging that you're using or producing or distributing is going to be subject to the laws, because as we've noted before, California, for example, has requirements that apply to paper-based products, whereas other laws and subsequent laws coming on the books may involve more products that are food packaging. One of the aspects when you're determining the application of the laws, do you sell your products regionally or nationally? When you're thinking about that issue, it's important to note that you're not always in complete control over your distribution system. Oftentimes we've seen through certain gray market distribution channels where products that are sold regionally wind up getting funneled to California because a distributor is selling them on Amazon, for example, or other online sales. So when you're thinking about all these aspects, you're going to have to figure out how your company is going to approach this issue. And, you always have the decision to continue to market products that are legal in certain jurisdictions, but not all, by either removing it entirely from your supply chain or just limiting its distribution to impacted states. So I'm going to switch it over to Emily, who's got a lot more experience with applying these issues in supply chain risk evaluation.
Yeah, so, one of the big things when it comes to compliance with this type of substance, PFAS in general, and kind of any emerging contaminant is, you're trying to take bites of the elephant. And the first step, after you've kind of built that team is you really need to start with, obviously the applicability of the products, but really what is your risk exposure as a company? Not only the types and, where your products are going, but how much inventory do you have on hand that you need to use up or get rid of or potentially move around? Because we've had and seen a number of packaging suppliers that have been switching over from PFAS to PFAS alternatives wide scale, but then maybe are not changing things like item numbers and other pieces of information that make it easy for you to track and remove things or divert product around. So that's one of the things that you need to do. And then also what states represent the greatest risk to your distribution of goods. So say, for example, you are distributing a produce product, let's say strawberries that are in a paper container with a plastic film top. The plastic film top piece is not subject to the PFAS laws, but the paper container would be in the state of New York. So you may have some risks there if, for example, the adhesive that's used to apply the film to the paper package contains PFAS, but you'd be able to potentially divert it to another state that does not have a PFAS law on the books. And then also with this, it helps you determine which of your packaging suppliers do you need to focus your efforts on more? Some may only be providing you paper products, some may be providing you plastics or other products that are subject to some of the laws that are not currently in effect. And that helps you, again, because you'll have this data in front of you, really help with your risk prioritization, because that's one of the things that you always want to focus on when dealing with compliance. Obviously, the goal is to be 100% in compliance with any law that exists and is applicable to your products. However, it's, again, taking those bites of the elephant, as you're able to. So, focusing on the value of products and also any previous relationships you've had with suppliers. You may have some where they are so readily forthcoming with information just because they have it and they were very prepared for compliance with the PFAS laws, or on other similar issues where you've been trying to vet your supply chain, to where you might be able to deprioritize your contacts to them, knowing that they're generally forthcoming with information. So when it focuses on approaching and facilitating discussions with your suppliers, there are a couple of different approaches you can take. The first one that I always would recommend is you really need to start with educating. As you recall, if you watched our first series, or our first part of this series, PFAS has a number of different definitions or connotations for people. So there's some education on the information that you're seeking. And really what is an ideal situation on this is you'd really like full material disclosure regarding the packaging that you have. And I know that some packaging providers are a little hesitant to provide that information, but it can help you not only with compliance with the PFAS regulations, but more holistically when you're implementing those supplier controls and the program that Seth just talked about, kind of taking that, medical device type approach that is maybe a little less common for us on certain issues in the food system. Now, if you have a company that is, maybe hesitant to provide you all of the information regarding the materials in their particular products, there are third-party platforms and clearinghouses that can help collect this information for you, and they do that on a regular basis, obviously for a fee, and it also helps evaluate that information in the event that you may not have an expert on food packaging or food packaging chemicals to understand whether the material information that you're provided actually includes PFAS or has PFAS as a risk. And if you have suppliers that, are not ready for the full material disclosure, or you're unable to afford the third-party platforms or clearinghouses, you can ask specifically about PFAS chemicals and whether or not they're added or intentionally used in the product. Since that's the focus of these laws, they're not as focused on whether or not there's contamination in the base materials outside of California, which does have that 100 ppm limit as well, in addition to the intentional use restriction. And, these pieces, can come in an email. And again, this is why you need your multiple disciplinary team. If you're sitting in legal or regulatory in the compliance space, you generally do not have those day-to-day interactions or communications with your vendors or suppliers. So that's why you need the procurement team to really help you get that information and facilitate those conversations. You can also request for copies of test results that they have regarding either specific PFAS compounds or total fluorine content, which Seth is going to talk about a little bit later on, test methods and the reliability of that information. And then also another area that you can consider requesting that, again, will help you with this evaluation and determining compliance and how often you need to go back and forth to the suppliers are the use of third-party certifications. We've listed 3 here on the screen that we're aware of that restrict the use of intentionally added PFAS, as well as, kind of look at that 100 ppm limit as well. So, there are third-party bodies that you can use to kind of help offload some of this, but unless you're mandating that one of these certifications exist or be used, the company may not necessarily have that information readily available. So the big piece in starting these discussions is education, as well as requesting the information and helping explain things, again, to what you actually need to help you with compliance, and whether or not you're looking at this on a holistic compliance, product compliance program, or if you're only going to look at it on an ad hoc basis on just PFAS. I would say because we have so many data requests for our suppliers, generally it's easier to go to them with a more holistic, request on information regarding your packages. But that will also take longer for that supplier likely to answer all of those questions. So just be aware of that if you're, when you're planning out your compliance plans with where you're providing product. And then the way that states are mandating, so they do have some mandatory kind of compliance pieces where they're requiring, in order for you to demonstrate compliance, is a receipt of a certification from that supplier that is issued directly to you on the specific products like food packaging or food packaging components that are provided to you that complies specifically with that state law or those state laws that may be applicable to them. So they, have those minimum requirements to require these supply chain certifications as the documentation to go down. In most instances, these states are requiring that they be signed by an authorized official within the organization, and generally they want those to focus on those who are in charge of manufacturing or distribution within the company, and or someone who's in product compliance, regulatory, or legal, who truly understands whether or not there is PFAS in the packaging. I know this is sometimes going to be difficult, but nobody really wants to see, or at least a state regulator doesn't want to see a salesperson having signed this certification because they don't have the knowledge or understanding necessarily of PFAS and its use in their products. Well, that may not necessarily be true. If you're thinking from a regulator's perspective, you want somebody who actually has that deep knowledge of the potential presence of PFAS to do this. And then the other requirement that they have is that these certifications be maintained on site where the food package is being distributed, sold, or offered for sale. And I know that can be very complicated, but, again, that just means if you have, multiple distribution centers and multiple locations, you'll just need to have an accessible database for them to be able to pull them in the event of an inspection to demonstrate compliance with the laws. Additionally, some pieces that you can have to help back up that certification is, information regarding test results and other things. And then also you can provide, there are a couple of different ways you can go about obtaining these certifications. You can either provide your own certification letter that meets the state requirements. I would say that the way that most of the companies we're working with are approaching this are using one certification for all of the states, but ensuring that the information that is provided in those certifications covers each of the different intricacies within the laws, kind of what we would call, like lowest common denominator type of compliance, where it's broad enough to cover everything, but you're able to tailor them more specifically to the specific customer that you're providing or the supplier that you're obtaining a certification from. If a supplier provides you a certification letter, you're going to have to look at that very specifically to make sure that it addresses the different pieces that I've outlined here on what states are requiring for certifications. I couldn't tell you how many times I've had somebody say, well, we sent you a compliance statement, and the compliance statement discusses, compliance with FDA regulations regarding use of PFAS in food packaging materials, which, as we know, they have many allowed intentional uses for PFAS, which would not, be compliant with these state regulations. So again, it's that education piece, but ensuring that what you receive back, and again, it's that back and forth piece that was on that compliance cycle that Seth showed. And then also just remember that some states also require that 100 ppm limit, such as California, which goes a little bit further than just the intentional use. And then just some other things that you should consider regarding acceptance of these certifications is, the sophistication of the business that you're working with, which is based on the history and information flow that you've had from that supplier. You should also consider the location of the manufacturer of the product. For example, we find that many of our overseas manufacturers, especially if they're in China, not that they're willing to sign anything, but because there is not necessarily a way to recover damages from them if there is an instance of non-compliance that was caused by them and a unreliable certification, that can make it difficult for you to again demonstrate that compliance and whether or not you kind of really did that true due diligence. And then also things that you can factor in that are really part of any supply chain management program and supplier management is reviewing of past audits and testing, especially if anything is specifically covering PFAS or PFAS substances. Again, you can mandate the third-party certification from any of those standards that we mentioned earlier. And then also, you need to make sure that you're getting PFAS information on each individual product, not just a broad-based blanket certification that all items supplied comply with PFAS. You really need that individual information, especially where you have states like Vermont that's about to come online that covers all food packaging. And your distribution networks in the Northeast, because New York only covers your paper-based products, you may end up where they say, well, we only really meant our paper products are in compliance, not our plastic products that we're also supplying you. So really getting that product-specific information is really going to be important for these certifications. Now back to Seth to talk about establishing a testing program in the event you try and use that to help with compliance.
Thanks. Yeah, so I get asked this often where we have a client runs into a problem, whether it's import that gets held up for an issue or they find that there's a contamination, and they'll come to us and ask, okay, so we have this problem, we need to start doing testing. It's like, well, this is the wrong time to start. If you're going to use testing to monitor your products, whether they're supplied to you or whether you're producing them, the time to develop the test methods and the testing program is before you have the problem, not after. Realizing that currently we're dealing with a situation where a new requirement has been thrust upon us and that we have to adapt to address these issues. But now's the time to put the controls in place for a test program, as opposed to waiting for a problem to occur after your compliance program is underway and you're using the test method to fill in a hole that you didn't realize was there. So leaving that aside, understand that when you develop a test method, you have to really think through what type of testing, when do you do the testing, and how frequently you do the testing. So oftentimes when you're thinking about developing a test method, it's better to do the testing in process during certain phases through testing of raw materials or in process products, instead of doing the testing on the finished product, because you're introducing a whole host of other pieces that can interfere with the test. So given that, basic understanding, there are also some other pieces that we consider when you're talking about what type of test are you going to use for each individual type of product that you're looking to test for. So, there are about 5 different elements that we look to determine, whether a test method is appropriate in the given situation. First is it specific? Is it capable of identifying what you're looking for? Broader tests, the sort of the shotgun approach, where you do one method of analysis that's going to hopefully identify multiple types of similarly related compounds. Sometimes those can produce false positives because they're too broad. They're if you look at spectroscopy, for example, separating out the lines in your chromatograph or your spectroscopy, if they're too close together, because you're trying to detect too many things, it's hard to tell, is this what you're looking for? Or is this just a compound that's interfering with the other items you're looking for? So it could either produce a false positive or obscure something that you're really looking to get. So for that reason, analysts will suggest that, when you're doing this multi-target testing, you include specific markers to measure the desired target. Accuracy. So, you can do testing and you can identify a compound, but if your test is detecting, let's say, a substance at a part per million, when your required limit is in the part per billion, well, that test isn't really going to be very suitable, because it's only going to report your results in parts per million, not the part per billion that you're looking for. The test procedures that give, as we said before with the specificity, if you're getting a wide range of results, it's really not suitable for quality testing. You need to have very specific results in order to meet what you're looking for. And, with a lot of these requirements, when we're talking about, intentionally added or, looking at certain ranges of detectability, in some respects, failing mark will be any detectable amount. So you need to be clear as to, ensuring that if you are going to rely on a test method, that test method is precise enough compared to other test methods that are out there. Reproducibility. So I hear this oftentimes where, I'll get called, we've just ran a test and we got a positive, but we're rerunning the test because we don't trust the results. If your method of detection is going to produce false positives that require you to do retesting, you need to think of picking a different test method. Because the problem comes when you run the testing, you have failing results, and then you produce another test that shows it passed. Agencies, regulatory authorities, litigators, whoever, will look at that and say, well, you only tested it to the point where you got a positive test. And one of the unfortunate things about testing is it's not a silver bullet. When you do the testing, where you choose to take your sample, the variations in the production process can result in some products producing passing results, some products producing failing results. If your test method isn't validated, this is an important factor when you're choosing your test method, you need to go through the process of validating it to make sure that it does provide you with the results you're looking to get. If your validation shows that you can have false positives, you need to be thinking about picking a different test method, because you don't want to create records, documentation that shows that you're doing the test, but then you're disregarding the results because you don't rely on the test. In fact, it's not a true measure of what's going on. When we talk about test methods as well, a lot of times you'll look to regulatory authorities or other organizations that have already established, whether it's guidelines or test methods, and use those test methods. So for, in the world of analytical chemistry for pharmaceuticals, the most reliable source for test methods is the USP, United States Pharmacopoeia. There are similar organizations that provide reliable results, but if there is no reliable method, you're going to have to develop your own. And anytime you do develop your own, you make sure that it's validated. And validation, when we talk about validation, it's a process that proves the validity of your test method. Basically, you take your product that you're going to study and you have the product as at a known tolerance of the contaminant, you test it, you show that the process identifies it, and then you introduce products that don't have the contaminant and show that the test doesn't result in false positives. And then finally, we talk about testing. You think about, how you're going to do test methodologies. Cost is an important factor. If you spend more money to test a product than the cost of that product, you might want to reconsider steps you need to take in order to change the test method. Part of the problem is, some test methods just take a long time. And if you're dealing with perishable commodities, that can be a problem. Fortunately, when we're talking about food packaging, we're not worried about the products, becoming expired, but you still also want to consider, if it's going to take you 2 months to run a test, that might be too long. The time and the cost of the test need to be factored into this. So something else, I do see this a lot, especially with these types of contaminant-based tests, whether it's a pesticide or whether it's, PFAS in particular. There's a lot of reliance by individuals outside of the food industry on EPA tests. And it's important to note that these EPA tests, while you could maybe jury-rig them for use for food packaging, what they're really intended for is, testing contaminants in soil and water. So sometimes the EPA tests, even though they're the only test available, might not be most suited for your application. So some of the product tests that are out there include, tests that look at total organic fluorine. You've got basically chromatography types of tests and spectroscopy types of tests, or spectrometry. Two different types of approaches. One is chromatography basically relies on taking your analyte, the thing you're trying to study, and breaking it down in a way and then passing it through some other substance so that the heavier parts go slower and the lighter parts go faster, and then you can detect each individual component as it passes through. Spectroscopy as an analysis method looks at the electromagnetic radiation that's emitted by the substance to see, does it meet does it match up with what you're looking for? Sometimes they'll even pair the two together, where you have chromatography to break up and then it'll feed into a mass spectrometry to identify each individual component. And then there's also quantification for specific PFAS using solvent extraction. And then that method will identify specific PFAS. And this might be useful if you're looking at intentionally added PFAS as opposed to contamination through environmental PFAS. Something to consider when you're looking at different test methods that might be available. generally, as I mentioned, there's a number of considerations, and challenges. Um, you know, there aren't a lot of PFAS capabilities right now. Labs are only just now bringing this capability online. Um, it's not validated for all packaging materials. So a lot of this, when you're developing these test methods, you're going to have to sit down with either your internal analytical team or working with a test lab to develop the validated methods that you're going to use. And just because you develop a test method for one type of product to detect certain types of PFAS, that isn't going to be applied to all products necessarily. The way that you would detect PFAS in a foam product would be different than paper or a fiber-based product is different than a plastic product. So you may have multiple methods that you need to develop for different types of products. As we talked about, while there are considerations about specificity, accuracy, the length of time it takes to complete a test or the cost of the test, methods will vary. And so, you may have multiple methods available and you'll have to choose the best method or the most suitable method for your application based on the cost, the length of time, how sensitive it is, how accurate it is. Total fluorine, as a measurement, we talked about it. It only identifies the amount of fluorine in the product, which is certainly indicative of PFAS, but it doesn't identify what PFAS compound you're actually seeing. So if you're trying to do analysis, that will also help you find out, a root cause for the contamination. Total fluorine test might not be suited for that application. Because a PFAS is a PFAS, whether you intended to add it or whether it found its way into your product because the trees that were grown in the field were contaminated with PFAS from downstream chemical plant. You don't know, is it intentionally added or is it a contaminant in the soil? Certainly, if you're not the manufacturer of that product, it's impossible to tell. So you just have to keep that in mind. That's why, if the best way of testing is generally going into the manufacturing process itself and doing the testing at that point. Basically, there's just a lack of authentic standards to identify and quantify PFAS in products, and there may well never be a sufficient number of tests to really use as authenticated methods. But a lot of companies are just going to have to develop what they can to meet those challenges. I'll switch it over to Emily to talk about customers.
So if you are in the manufacturing or distribution tier as it relates to food packaging, you'll be responding, I'm sure, to a number or have been responding to and fielding a number of customer requests who are, trying to manage their own compliance with the PFAS laws, as well as just even understand the PFAS that is present in their supply chain. So one of the best ways to, approach these is it's worth a conversation to understand the customer's approach to PFAS. As we said at the beginning, it's important for you to also know what your company is trying to do with PFAS. But many of the retailers, especially, who are kind of at the forefront of potential enforcement because they're actually selling products, whether it's a food that is packaged or the food packaging itself for use, at a restaurant or something, they're the ones who are really at the front line and needing to manage compliance. But it's good to know whether or not they're looking at PFAS as a category that they want to completely get out of, or if, again, they're focusing on a more targeted approach of only eliminating PFAS in the states where there are laws on the books that impact their particular products. It's also good to know who will be identifying an alternative product if a replacement is needed. Are you going to be doing that as the manufacturer distributor and providing a list of potential alternative products? Or is it something that the customer wants to mandate because they have very particular characteristics or particular manufacturers that they want to work with on specific products? So that's really the first conversation. Is important to have that back and forth, we find, with our customers. Just to also, you can tell them where you're at in your compliance posture and how they can expect the information to come to them. What we've been finding is a lot of the information needs to be provided on a rolling basis, partially because the suppliers don't always have the information handy. And especially as we're focused now kind of on this phase 2 of compliance, which applies to all products and not just the paper and paperboard ones, because states like Vermont and Maryland and Minnesota apply to all food packaging regardless of the material type. So you may have to go back to your customers. Again, that's part of that iterative process of back and forth, where they may have questions regarding the data that you provide or information, and you may have to supplement new information, especially because your suppliers may give you new information that they need to be informed of. You also need to determine what kind of is your trigger point to actually be able to provide a certification to them. There are some companies who are very hesitant to provide any kind of certification until they have information regarding all of the products that they're supplying to a retailer. And then again, if they're pushed to provide an interim one because they're going to be cut off and not be able to provide to that important customer to their business, they may need to develop and tailor the certification in a way that allows them to supplement it in the future. And again, like Seth said, in that, when we're talking about managing compliance in this space, having those notifications from the manufacturer go to the distributor to eventually make its way to the retailer so they can make an informed decision on their own compliance. And then another thing that we're seeing quite a bit is many of our customers are actually asking for information across the board for all goods, not just food packaging. So be aware if you're a distributor that distributes more than just food packaging, or you're a packaging manufacturer who makes more than just food packaging and supplies it to a company because they make a wide variety of consumer packaged goods, they may ask about those products as well, mostly because they are monitoring the same way that we are, states covering a wide variety of goods, even though food packaging has been the primary target at this point in time. So the next step is you've identified what products may have PFAS. How do you work through and identify alternatives if that's something you're doing as a food manufacturer yourself, or if you're doing that as a packaging manufacturer distributor to help your customers make informed decisions? One of our first steps would be just take a look at the states that have already identified safer alternatives. Specifically, the state of Washington has done that. They have a lengthy evaluation process where they have identified available as well as safer alternatives to PFAS in food packaging applications. So that in certain ones. So that may be a way to kind of start where you can identify alternatives if the ultimate goal of your company is to move completely away from food packaging with PFAS in it. As a part of that, there's obviously a little bit of kind of R&D as it relates to that to make sure that that alternative actually performs the way that you need it to in that particular application or to meet the needs of your customer. And then, that you then also have to factor in whether or not the supplier that you may be required to work with or that you do work with, can they actually produce that alternative for you? Or is there going to be a need to find a new vendor completely because these applications just don't exist necessarily through your current suppliers? And then another thing that's really important, because this is something that butts up with a number of the companies we've been working with, where you need to make sure, if you say you were taking the approach where California and New York were your only two major markets, and that's where all of your risk lied as it related to your food packaging. you may have issues moving to a plastic type product, as a potential physical alternative, because of the limitations on recyclability of that packaging or something like that, and where it doesn't necessarily meet your company's stated sustainability initiatives and goals. So there is, a little bit of work that needs to be done there to make sure that everyone within your company is actually, as you make these transitions into other products, everything is being met for everyone. And I know that means, that feels like a lot, but that's again why you have that multiple disciplinary team to ensure that what you're doing actually achieves you as well as your customers' goals as it relates to replacement products. So the next piece is you've set up this program, you've identified alternatives, you have a general awareness of where you may or may not have PFAS in your packaging, but you should also consider monitoring your supply chain. So you've established this program, you have the information, but you need to ensure that it is reliable on a consistent basis and really on a go forward basis. So you're not constantly in this triage and hot spotting issues. So this would be part of your program. You would establish how you are going to monitor your supply chain to ensure both accuracy of the information that has been provided, as well as reliability of those certifications. Again, this is a very similar risk-based approach that we would recommend. And you can tackle it in a couple of different ways, but one way that happens that we know a number of retailers as well as food manufacturers do is they kind of develop an overall compliance program supplier questionnaire that helps gather information regarding the presence of PFAS, as well as other substances and other information generally needed for compliance about that particular product. Again, you consider things like whether or not you want to conduct on-site audits. Is that something you can use a third party for that would look at and focus in on some of these issues? Is there a third-party scheme that actually covers PFAS? In the food space, we're used to SQF and many of those. And at this point in time, I don't believe they have a component that covers PFAS, but maybe that's something that, they may consider adding into their programs, as we continue to adjust and make those standards even more useful for us. Additionally, you can consider establishing a testing protocol based on risk profile of your products, as well as the reliability and history of your supplier to triage who you would be focused on your testing. Or are you just going to do randomized testing? Again, you should have a protocol or procedure on how you identify those products that do get tested, but also recognize those limitations as it relates to testing that Seth mentioned. What are you going to do with that data once you have it, as well as something that's really important? And then you determine the frequency. Is this annual testing? Is this something where you're doing random product tests every 2 to 6 months? Another thing that you should definitely make sure that you do is obtain your recertification at least annually from these companies, from these suppliers. But again, it's also very important as companies transition away from PFAS, you continue to understand what they're using either to replace it or what replacement products exist, so that you again can communicate down the supply chain and up the supply chain as necessary regarding those products. And then obviously documentation is always important. While monitoring is not required by any of these state laws, this is how we would recommend you approach it in a risk-based fashion. Another thing that you need to do is manage your current inventory that may be impacted and subject to these laws. This is kind of a no-brainer. For the most part, everybody does this anyways, but first and foremost, if you have not already done it, we highly recommend adopting first in, first out inventory management in the event you do have any food packaging that includes PFAS. So you can move that out and also are aware of, where you can actually divert that product so it isn't going into these markets with bans in place and being subject to potential fines. Another way is to request and work with your suppliers to add additional identifiers to help you track and trace products that may contain PFAS, especially if they're doing any kind of transition away from a product that previously used PFAS and is not. It will really help you determine when that changeover actually occurs and when you start receiving that product, because like you, they likely have backed up inventory that they're trying to move through to move to this PFAS free status as well, or, you know, non-intentionally added PFAS products. And then again, as possible, consider diverting inventory where you either have a question about the presence of PFAS in food packaging, or where you know that it is and that package is subject to a state ban. And quickly we'll go through a couple of lessons learned, but a lot of it is education. It's educating both within your company as well as with your suppliers and your customers. And one of the things that we found was most important was we really need leadership buy-in to have a top-down approach as it relates to addressing PFAS. I've heard sometimes from procurement and especially sales, well, if somebody wants to buy it, we're going to procure it and provide it to them. However, that puts your business at significant risk for penalties, especially if you have not obtained this proper certification or of some kind of indemnification agreement with the customer where they have made the informed decision to purchase a PFAS product, PFAS containing product, and they are the ones who are choosing to do the sale or distribution in a state. Again, attempting to limit your liability, but everybody needs to be able to make that informed decision. Again, management can be extremely difficult depending on your procurement system. We found it especially most challenging in decentralized procurement systems, but there are ways to management. It just can take a lot more time and effort on your part to really set it up and make sure that it is running as efficiently as possible. Another is, again, suppliers don't always have this information readily available because they're using different definitions. They don't understand what intentionally added means, or, you know, they're just willing to sign any certification because that's what they need to do to keep supplying you. Additionally, we're hearing customers want all goods, anything provided to them, not just food packaging, again, so they can understand even just the presence of PFAS in their food supply or in their supply chains, and limit it where possible. Additionally, one thing that's really important is what we're doing right now is looking backwards at products that are currently in our supply chain. You also need to think about procurement on a go-forward basis and how, when you're onboarding, whether it's a new product, a new type of packaging, anything like that, that you have done that due diligence at the front end to make sure that your products are, you still have that knowledge of PFAS and are not unintentionally bringing in some new product that contains PFAS and it ends up in a market where you didn't intend it to be. Or if your company's philosophy is to completely get out of it, again, you need to have procurement and leadership buy-in to make sure that you're gathering that information out front, not later in the process, because no supplier likes having to answer ad hoc questions being thrown at them all the time. And as you know, I'm going to underline, for probably any regulatory scheme, testing into compliance is just not possible. You can use testing to help demonstrate compliance, but it is not the way to say intentionally added is not used, based on the information that, you know, Seth has provided earlier. And then additionally, if you don't have somebody who's already tasked specifically with product compliance, because it is more than just PFAS, your company may want to consider looking into that, because this can be a really large job, especially if you're a packaging distributor, and have a wide number of products, and you're not doing any of the manufacturing. So you don't necessarily have that institutional knowledge that you've had in the past. Some of the things that are on the horizon, we have a number of states that have laws coming into effect in the next 8 months or so. And as Leah mentioned, there are at least 8 other states that we anticipate are, you know, bringing new laws online. And then another area we really wanted to highlight is there have been at least 3 companies, food companies specifically, that are selling branded products that have been targeted for the presence of PFAS in their food packaging. Now, the first 2 primarily focus on false advertising type cases where a claim like all natural or pure were used and there was PFAS in the packaging, and they said, you know, it's false and deceptive because of the use of those terms, but you have this, you know, potentially hazardous chemical in the packaging. The other case deals a little bit more with a personal injury type suit, where the amount of PFAS that was contained in the packaging of the fast food item was extremely high, that they were saying it was basically unlawful to market the product in a state that didn't even have a PFAS food packaging ban. And then another thing that you need to consider is, depending on the alternatives that you are identifying, it could eventually end up being the target of a law in a state if data, is generated that demonstrates that it's either not safer than PFAS or is as safe as PFAS use. So we're going to be continuing to deal with these chemicals of concern, emerging contaminants, as Leah called them, over the years, and that's just kind of the nature of compliance. Now, I know we don't have very much time, but if there does happen to be any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, as we're happy to answer them. But I know we gave you a lot to chew on in this. All right, well, I don't see any coming in, but our contact information is on the screen, so feel free to send us any questions that you may have. And thank you so much for joining us today. We hope the information was helpful to you and your organization. As a reminder, this program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEUC icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with the recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. This concludes our webinar. Thank you.